and welcome. You are listening to The Adam Messer Show, and I am your host, Adam Messer. And my special guest today is a very interesting and nice lady who is just like fantastic. We've already actually had a conversation pre-recorded, but it just turned out that I was able to be in the studio live today. So Ellen Datlow is here with me. Ellen, thank you so much for being with me in the studio, or actually you're on the phone, but being live with me on the radio today.
You're welcome.
So everybody, the next hour, like this first hour, Ellen and I are going to talk live, and then the next hour I'm going to play the pre-recorded podcast episode. And so you'll be able to listen to that. We talk like in the next hour, we talk about like, her background and her history and, editing and that kind of stuff. So we're going to get kind of more into that like the next hour. But this hour, I wanted to talk to you, Ellen, about like your love of like horror and sci-fi. I want to talk to you a little bit about your show that you do with the Fantastic Fiction at KGB, and then about the Women in Horror month.
Sure.
So, yeah, but I'm pretty excited. Would you mind just giving like a little brief interview or introduction about yourself?
Sure. I've been editing for about 40 years or more. I'm not even sure. I started magazine editing at OMNI Magazine. I edit mostly short stories and novellas. I have edited a few novels, but not very often. I'm not a proficient novel editor. I've edited for magazines, websites, and I edit and I acquire or I create anthologies, original and reprint anthologies. And I started out mostly doing science fiction for OMNI, but I've also, in the last 20 years, 30 years, I've gotten more into horror fiction, starting with co-editing the year's Best Fantasy and Horror with Terry Windling and then Gavin Grant and Kelly Link. I did the horror section, and now I guess I'm working on number 13. I think I'm finished. Yeah, I'm working on number 13 of the Best Horror of the Year. So I've been mostly steeped in horror in the last 30 years or so. Although when I edit for Tour.com, I've been buying science fiction and fantasy as well as horror for the website.
I think that's really cool, especially the span of your career as an editor. And like I said, we've got that whole other interview we can talk about like the next hour. Everybody's gonna be listening to that. But I'm just really excited. I mean, like, because you've seen decades worth of change, and you've seen probably the good, bad, and the ugly of what's out there in the literature. So I think it's pretty cool. Sebastian is my son, and he is here live in the studio, and he's going to play a little bit for us. You ready, Bass?
Sebastian.
Yep.
All right, here is Sebastian, and Ellen, I'm going to put this on speaker so you can hear it. Awesome, Bass. Thank you very much. Ellen, I hope you could hear that, because the way that the sound...
That was great.
Yeah, the way the soundboard works, it like doesn't go through the aux for some reason. And I'm actually... I just want to share this with you. He had his first gig last night ever.
Wow, congratulations. Solo or with the group?
Well, that's the thing. Bass, you want to share a little bit real quick?
It was with my band, Krieger. It's just 3 of us right now. We're looking for a drummer. We played with the house drummer last night.
Well, he's been playing on the show with me for like the last 3 years. So we've been doing the show.
Wow, cool.
And
does
so
does he create his own music? I assume he writes his own music.
We're working on it.
He does. He he's really getting into more of the vocals now too. But he's been he's been creating his own riffs and stuff for a long time. But it was making me think about like when you were doing your events at the KGB. His gig last night was what was it called? The Brick Wall?
Yeah, the Brick Wall Cafe in Hinesville.
Yeah, and they were like a coffee shop. And so, like, you go in, it's like one of those shotgun, like old school kind of buildings. And you go in, and it was a cool little setup. It was a cool little coffee shop. I thought it was neat.
Yeah, I think it was a good place to play at for the first time.
Yeah, it just kind of reminded me when we were talking about your fantastic fiction at the KGB.
Which is at the KGB bar in the East Village, yes.
Yeah, I love little venues like that where you can do events and stuff.
Yeah, they run events almost every day. Well, before the pandemic, they ran events almost every day of the week, and we're like every third Wednesday we do it in every month. But since then, we've been doing it a virtual one for about a year now, almost, which gives us the advantage that we can get people from all over the world, which we usually can't because they can't get to New York. So in a way, it's been fun doing it that way. And we're thinking that when we actually go back in person, we may try to do some kind of a live stream, a small, not the way we do it now, but to have a live stream of the event when we do them live, if we can figure it out.
That would be cool, yeah, because I've checked out a couple of the episodes of that, and that's a really interesting conversation that y'all do.
Yeah, I mean, usually when we actually did it live, we did not have Q&As. I mean, I don't know if we would start incorporating them into the live, live events. But for the virtual ones, they've been a lot of fun and interesting.
Yeah, I love.
And viewers seem to like them.
I love how like at home y'all are. It's just like even because I know we talked and the next hour is gonna have a little more details, but you're talking about like you have sometimes you try to pair up like someone who's like a better well known name with a person who's like a newer author or whatever, and y'all seems just so natural when you're doing the show, just kind of like you're just hanging out and chilling.
Well, we don't have to do much. I mean, actually, Matt's the one who can remember how to recite the history of the bar. It's like, I can't do that. I can't remember it. Don't you do it?
Yeah.
Because every month we might have new viewers who don't know the history of the bar, which was like, it was like a Ukrainian communist social club. That's how it started. Excuse me. And then it was bought, and it's now 3 venues. The Crane Theater, which is actually where the KGB came from, Crane something. I mean, I don't remember, K-R-A-I-N-E. That's a theater downstairs. We're one flight up, the bar itself, and upstairs is kind of like a speakeasy that has events, too. So there are 3 floors, all fire hazards.
Yeah.
And no elevator.
Yeah, you were telling me, like no elevator, so it's a trek. You got to go up and down.
Yeah.
And that's Matthew Kressel?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
cool.
He's been doing it with me for at least 10 years, which is weird.
Wow.
To think that I've been doing it as long as I've been doing it at all.
Oh, wow.
Hosting it, yeah.
Yeah, I like doing that. Like here in Savannah, I host a couple of like author events and stuff, and but we had to do the same thing. Like one of the events that I host is called the Savannah Books and Brews, and it's a fundraiser, a charity fundraiser that we do for the Ronald McDonald Charities of the Coastal Empire. And that was one of the things that broke my heart last year was we couldn't do the live events to try to raise money for the house, and we ended up actually doing a Kickstarter GoFundMe thing. We did a GoFundMe thing, and we made our goal. And I was like, so I'm kind of glad
that's great.
Yeah, be able to do something like we're online where people, and most of the people that donated actually weren't even they don't even live in Savannah, so.
I mean, we've gotten a few donations. I mean, what we do is we have done 2 Kickstarters over the years, so hopefully we don't have to do another one for a long time.
Yeah.
It's to raise enough money, because what we do is, I mean, the readings are free, but we tip the bartender. The drinks for the readers are free, and for us, for me and Matt, but we tip the bartender as well. We pay the writers a stipend, each writer, and we take them out to dinner afterwards. So that comes to like $150 or so a month. So we had raised enough money to last for at least a few years, and actually now we have a Nightfire Tours. Nightfire is going to give us some money for sponsorship, so that'll help continue it. And at one time, for about a year or two, Cemetery Dance gave us some money. So that's really very nice. And now even the virtual ones, we don't take the writers to meals anymore, but we still pay. We pay the bar anyway. We pay the bartenders, some bucks. We pay the venue some bucks, and they give some of the money to the bartender just to keep them going. And
well, that's really cool.
Yeah, and we've had some people donate money to us, to keep it going. I mean, every month we get a few bucks through PayPal, which is really cool.
I think it's cool because I mean, there's it's so crazy, but they're just depends on where you're at, I guess. But there's not a ton of different like here in Savannah. There's a couple of really cool bookstores, locally independent owned bookstores or whatever, and even last year, like there's not a whole lot of venues to go to do author events.
Right. Well, there aren't that many in New York, that'll do them, except for big names. Oh, no. So that's why, I mean, it's great. I mean, we used to sell books, and sometimes we still do, but it's hard because most book either the publisher or certainly the bookstores don't want to bring the books.
Right.
They have to hire someone to bring the books and sell them. And if they don't sell like a ton of books, they think it's a failure. So, it's kind of tough to have it, which is why, I mean, our readings are free, but, we have readers bring their own books to sell if they choose to.
Oh, okay. That's cool. Yeah, I'm surprised that in New York City there wouldn't be that many venues that do like author events and stuff.
Not bookstores. I mean, there are a lot of regular book events. I mean, Erewhon is doing them now, and they're doing a salon, or they were before the pandemic. The New York Review of Science Fiction, run by Jim Freund, Hour of the Wolf, and stuff like that. He does a regular thing, and he's gone virtual. I mean, so there are a handful. There's one or two. There's maybe one in Queens. I forget. Daniel Brown, I think, runs one. I forget what it's called. So there are, periodically some pop up. I think ours is Nurses is the longest running, and then KGB, I think, after that.
I think it's cool you've been doing it for like 10 years because we've been doing the Books and Brews.
We've been doing it for more than that.
Oh, really?
Matt's been doing it for 10 years. Oh, yeah, we started in the late 90s.
Oh, wow. Okay, tell me more about that.
Terry Bisson and Alice Turner.
Tell me more about that.
Well, it was started by Alice Turner and Terry Bisson. Alice Turner was the fiction editor of Playboy, and Terry's a writer. And they decided to do this event, a reading that would combine mainstream writers and genre writers to show that the roots were pretty similar. They could be similar. And so they did it for a few years. Alice left. She left Playboy at some point. I can't remember exactly what year, and then she gave it up to me. She didn't have the context anymore. She just didn't want to do it, so I took over for Alice. And Terry and I did it for several years until Terry moved to San Francisco. I mean, he used to live in Brooklyn, he and his family, and he moved to San Francisco. So at that point, Gavin Grant started doing it with me. Now, Gavin Grant and Kelly Link used to live in Brooklyn, but they moved to Northampton, Massachusetts when they had a kid. So for about 6 months or so, Gavin commuted from Northampton, which was like 2 or 3 hour commute to do it, and finally decided it was too much of a hassle. So that's when I brought Matt Kressel on. So yeah, it's been going on since the late 90s. Oh,
that's cool. Yeah, we just started doing ours like in 2018 for the Books and Brews. So it's neat because you get like a little community of people. Some of the regulars, you see the same regulars that support it. And do y'all get?
We've had people who've been coming for the whole time.
Wow.
Different people come in and come out, and drop in and drop out, depending on what their schedules are.
Mm-hmm.
And also how their state of if they can walk up the stairs.
Yeah, I can imagine that could be like a hindrance for some folks too. So. Let me do the station ID real quick. Everybody, you're tuning in today to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. This is the Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, with my special guest, Ellen Datlow. And today we're just kind of hanging out, chilling, talking about cool stuff. So. I'm really excited to have you on. So everybody at home, this is actually the second time Ellen and I are talking. So originally I was supposed to be working, and I asked her if we could just record it. And so we've got an hour recording coming up, the 4:00 hour for y'all, like a special edition. And then
it's more of the basics.
Yeah, like the nuts and bolts stuff. And so I asked Ellen today because I was able to actually be in the studio. I asked her if she would come on and hang out with us. So yeah, thank you. I talked to a lot of authors and on the show, and we talk about like what they're working on, their projects and stuff like that. And then recently, I've been talking to people like about their love of storytelling, because there's so much stuff out there about the nuts and bolts. And I love to learn from everybody. I love to find out like what works for them, or what kind of things that they say. Hey, cut this out, don't do this, or just kind of whatever. But I've been really getting into like the love of story and the love of storytelling, and so you read a lot, and
Yep.
you read mainly I know we were talking before. You read a lot for your job, and you enjoy the reading that you do. Could you kind of tell us, or not kind of, but would you tell us more about like your love of the art of story and storytelling and reading a good book?
Well, sure. I mean, I've been reading since I was a kid. I mean, I've always loved reading. I was a kid who my mom had, instead of playing outside, I would be inside reading, and my mom would have to like knock on the door several times. Come and eat.
Yeah.
In a minute. I'm reading. Or I'd read the cereal box while I was eating too.
Oh yeah, they used to have like little cartoons on them. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I've been reading, since I was a kid, and I read all kinds of things, but I really loved fantasy from the beginning and dark material. I mean, I read the Odyssey and I liked the Odyssey much more than the Iliad. I thought the Iliad was boring. The Odyssey was great, more adventure, more fantasy. And I started reading H.P. Lovecraft and Ray Bradbury as a teenager, young teenager probably. And I realized I liked more fantastic material. Although at a certain point in my teenage years, I read a bunch of historical potboilers, Irving Stone's books and Harold Robbins' books, and I read all that kind of stuff. But I loved science fiction. I loved horror. So I've been reading it my whole life, basically. I mean, I just love reading. And the idea that, I feel really lucky because in the jobs I've had, or I have, I can switch back and forth between science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I may have submissions for Tor.com that are fantasy or science fiction or horror. I'm working on anthologies that might be horror or might not be. The Shirley Jackson anthology I'm working on it's dark. Some of it's horror, but some of it's just uncanny and weird. So I can, right now I'm a freelancer, and I've been freelancing for at least 20 years. I mean, I do a lot of different things, so I can switch off between different projects, and just, if I'm bored with something, and say, oh yeah, I'll read for this now. I'll read for the best of the year.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, I mostly read short fiction at this point. I mean, I do read some novels, but not that many.
I before we got on, I was talking to you about the book that I've been reading, the last interviews, and the one I'm reading is with Ray Bradbury, and he always considered himself to be a fantasy writer. And I know a lot of folks want to call him a science fiction writer, but
it wasn't very accurately scientifically.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of it was marketed as science fiction, but yeah, it was really more fantasy and dark fantasy. And he did some really good horror stories too.
Oh yeah, I never read any of his stuff except for the compulsory Fahrenheit 451 in high school until last year. And a friend of mine posted a video, like you remember those old school videos that were like the old school like movies that they would play, like a day in the life of, Well, this one was a day in the life of like Ray Bradbury, and it was a little old black and white film, and going around or whatever. And they take him, like, he had his, I guess when he had his apartment or whatever, he used to have like a writing area down in the basement, and across from his typewriter was a little handwritten sign that said "Don't overthink." And that was the moment that really connected me with him. I was like, oh, okay, so here's a guy, Ray Bradbury, don't overthink it. And so last year I just started consuming like tons of stuff that I could read, anything I could read. Like I was listening to his lectures and watching his videos and stuff. And so yeah, it's.
Did you read a lot of his short fiction?
I've got the big red book with the 100 short stories, and I probably read like 40 or 50 of them.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a pretty good overview.
I was surprised because like I said, I'd never read anything except for the compulsory Fahrenheit 451. So I thought that's what all he wrote, and so I was never really interested in him because I read a lot as a kid too. I mean, like I was an avid reader, and I read a lot of science fiction. I read a lot of fantasy. We used to go to this bookstore where we could do, the little trade paperbacks. You trade them in.
Mm-hmm.
They had new ones, and it's something like you get like a credit and you trade it in, and whatever. So we used to go like maybe once or twice a month, and we'd load up on books, go to the library. I live like 2 blocks from the library, so
I used to go to the library all the time.
And I just loved it, and so I was like,
I mean, the problem with compulsory reading in school is you never want to read it. I read things in school that I never wanted to read those authors again. I hated what I read, but mostly what I read in school. And I'm not sure why. I mean, I'm not sure if it just wasn't my taste or if it's the way they taught. But I hardly anything I read. I don't remember anything in school that I read that I enjoyed. But I might be wrong. I might be mistaken.
We read. I remember talking about horror. We read The Long Walk. Stephen King's. I think it was a Richard Bachman book or whatever. But The Long Walk, and
in school.
Yeah, 9th grade.
Wow.
9th grade lit.
Wow.
We read that.
Well, see, if I was reading that, I'd be happy.
Yeah.
We never got assigned things like that. No.
Yeah.
It was more like the Scarlet Letter and Charles Dickens and.
We read those too.
And Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island.
Yeah.
I don't care for.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, the thing is too, we didn't really read any Edgar Allan Poe stuff. But I was like senior year, I was in English. I had my English teacher. His name was Mr. Beach, and so we did Shakespeare all year. And it's funny, but that turned me on. Now, I'm not an avid Shakespeare reader, but it turned me on, and I really could appreciate the art of playwriting and the sonnets and.
Sure.
One of the things
I just remembered that there was, one year I did enjoy what we read. I think it was 9th grade, and we had a teacher who assigned us all these contemporary fiction writers that I'm sure came obviously, Newsweek and Time magazine used to have like the best young writers of 20 writers or whatever of the decade or the year, whatever. And I read a bunch of. We read Updike and Philip Roth and John Knowles. I mean, we read all that stuff, and I enjoyed that. I mean, those I liked at the time. But that was by 9th grade. Before that, it was like stuff I hated.
Yeah, it's crazy, like how it's changed too. Because I remember even when I was a kid, I was born in '76, so I was growing up in the '80s, and I was reading like. I was one of those kids that by the 3rd and 4th grade, I was reading on like a 12th grade level, And so I was reading the stuff that my dad would read or my mom would read and whatever. And I just remember back then it was like, if you were into sci-fi or D&D and stuff like that, you were like a nerd and it's like whatever. But I used to read all the time. And then today it's like that's kind of like the pop culture stuff. It's like everybody's like all the stuff when I was a kid was like nerdy, It's like
yeah. In the high school, we used to have study hall, and our study hall was in the library. And I remember reading a lot of American plays. I mean, I read like the best plays of this year, the best plays of that year. And I read a lot of Tennessee Williams, and I don't think I read Beckett there because he wasn't. I mean, no, I don't think. I'm sure he wasn't in there, but I definitely William Ing, Sing, Syng. But it was absolutely Tennessee Williams, who I adored.
Was that was that what kind of prompted you to get into editing? Was your love of reading?
Basically, I had no idea what I was going to do. I knew that I loved reading, and the options were working in publishing, working at a bookstore, and working in a library. I had no idea what else I could do, and I didn't even know what publishing meant at that point. It was kind of something that I kind of fell into, although I knew that I wanted to get into it because I didn't know what else. I mean, I guess I must have heard about publishing somehow. I really do not remember the connect between, I read, I should get into book publishing.
Yeah.
And it wasn't magazine publishing at all. It was book publishing. And I don't know what made my brain think that that's something I should do. I realized, I had worked in a library in college, and I didn't think I wanted to do that. Although what I did, of course, was shelving, so it wasn't exactly library science. But I didn't think I wanted to work in a library. I used to go to bookstores a lot, and it's like, luckily I I didn't think through that. Oh, you work in a bookstore, you don't make much money, do you? So anyway, I'm not exactly sure how I decided maybe I should get into publishing, but that's what I did. So my first jobs were in book publishing. It wasn't until I was in book publishing like 5 years or so, and the first magazine job I had was at OMNI.
What is like some of your most memorable books that you just treasure that you like to go back to and revisit?
Well, I don't read books. I don't reread books. Well, there are a couple, not many, and I haven't in a long time. Now I do not have time to reread books.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was younger, I used to reread. I read The Man Who Was Thursday several times by Chesterton. But see, I never knew it was a religious book. To me, it wasn't religious. It was just, I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's very metaphysical, and it was the kind of book that you'd start reading, and then something horribly sad happened. The next page, it was all a joke or something. It just a complete turnaround, and you'd laugh hysterically. And I just loved that book. I must have read that at least 3 times. And I reread The Magus a couple of times when I was a lot younger, John Fowles' novel. But I hardly ever reread anything, and now I never reread. Actually, the only thing I have reread, I did reread William Gibson's The Peripheral. I read The Peripheral, and he's my guilty pleasure because he's not horror, so it's like I don't care. But I read The Peripheral, and I immediately reread it. I had planned to do that with Agency, which I loved, but I haven't had time to reread it. So I hardly ever reread anything as far as novels go. I just don't have the time.
Yeah, with work and all. Are you a fast reader?
Well, what's really weird is when I have reread things by accident. I've gone to, in desperation, I remember going on a plane, and I was in a very small bookstore in the airport, and I needed something to read, and I picked up a crime novel. And it wasn't until like halfway through that I realized I'd read it already. But I couldn't remember the ending anyway. I never remember the endings.
Oh, okay.
So it was like, okay, I'll read. This seems really familiar. But I don't remember how it ends.
Something about this. Are you a fast reader? I mean, like, do you have like different speeds for like pleasure reading and like work reading?
I'm not a speed reader. I can be fast.
Yeah.
Sometimes I want to slow down so I can actually enjoy the language. But when I'm reading and editing short stories, it forces me to slow down because the final process that I do is a line edit, so I have to read line by line, and that forces me to slow down in the read. But that's professional. That's not how I usually read. So I read fast, but not speed. Definitely not a speed reader.
Yeah. That's interesting. It's so weird too because like when you're talking about having to slow down for being professional, this last fall I published a book, and so I just started like getting my feet wet into editing, and it's interesting. It's really interesting, and I really enjoy it. And I like it. But yeah, it's a different. It's work. When you're editing it, it's work, and it just depends on what level you want to be at, right? If you want.
The first read, when I read a story for the first time, I just try to enjoy it and not get stuck on details. But if it's a submission, I might note something as I read. This doesn't make sense or that. So I'll take notes if I have to.
Yeah, something disjointed or something.
I try to just immerse it and enjoy it.
Yeah.
And not work on the editing.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel when I'm reading for pleasure. I want to read it through, and if it's something I enjoy, like if the story's got me hooked in, I want to read it and not be like, oh well, let me nitpick it or let me kind of do like the editing process, like oh this isn't right or that's not right or whatever. But we're gonna do a little station break for about 2 minutes, Ellen. And then we're going to come back. And everybody, thank you so much for listening today to WRUU, LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. And I'm about to hit the little things here. So we'll be right back.
The Live Oak Public Library System offers local residents access to hundreds of thousands of movies, television programs, albums, audiobooks, ebooks, and digital comic books for free on your streaming television and mobile devices through the Hoopla app. Supported devices include Roku, Fire, Apple TV, iPhone, and Android, among others. The selection is vast. All you'll need is your library card. Find the Hoopla app on your device and more information at liveoakpl.org.
What does it mean when we say that WRUU is a community radio station? It doesn't just mean that we invite the community to create programming, and it doesn't just mean that we are a voice for the community. It also means that we are counting on the community to keep us going, and you are the community. Almost all of our modest budget comes from small annual or monthly donations from listeners like you. You get to enjoy our community-focused programming because many others have stepped forward to do their part. Now do your part by joining our community of listener donors. Go to wruu.org right now and make a one-time or monthly donation. And thank you for supporting Savannah's community radio station, 107.5 FM.
WRUU-LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul.
This portion of WRUU Savannah Soundings programming is provided by listeners and by Brighter Day Natural Foods. Brighter Day Natural Foods has been serving Savannah's healthy food and supplement needs since 1978. It is located at the corner of Bull Street and Park Avenue. They have available online ordering and curbside delivery, and now a walk-up window for smoothies, juices, and sandwiches from the deli. They are open from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday, and 12 to 5:30 p.m. on Sunday. More information can be found at brighterdayfoods.com.
All right, everybody, and here is Sebastian Messer playing for us here in the studio. Oh, that was awesome, Bass. Thank you. And Ellen, could you hear it that time? Ellen?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, dude. We Brian, you remember Brian Ralph Bass? He just messaged in and said he was listening to the show and he sounded really good. So I thought that was cool.
Okay.
And then yeah, and he's enjoying it. And Terry and Darlene Dremel, they are listening in, and they said that they were really enjoying the interview. So thanks a lot, Ellen. This is cool.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
That's one of the joys I think about doing live radio, is that I don't do call-in where I have people call in or whatever, because I think it would be just kind of a little too much, trying to do an interview or whatever. But some of the folks message or whatever during the thing, I'm like, oh, that's so cool. It's always a neat little feeling, So.
Yeah, sometimes you get questions or comments you don't want.
Oh, yeah. And we'll see, that's the thing. It's completely live. We don't have one of those, like our studio is a community radio station, and we don't have one of those systems where, it's like pre-recorded and plays like a second or two later where it could beep stuff out.
Right. Oh, that could be really dangerous.
Yeah. And people don't realize it's like, FCC regulated. It's like, yeah, there's I think like a $10,000 fine or something like that when people do that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So it's crazy. But anyway, back to the show. We were talking about like reading and like your love of reading, and so next month is February is the Women of Horror month every year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you have done a bunch of interviews with that. Could you talk about like what you see with that, and like what you see on the horizon with that in the future?
Well, eventually I'd like to see there be no need for it.
Mm-hmm.
But over the years, I've been working in horror for a few decades now,
mm-hmm.
and what I do see is many more women writers. There are always female readers, but and everyone was saying, well, there are no writers, there are no women writing horror. And just from my reading for the year's best, early on when I started doing it, like 1987 or 8, I think my first year's best was, the fantasy, my co-editor chose the fantasy, and basically it evened out because most of the people she took were female for the fantasy, and most of what I took for my half, the horror, were men, were male, and that has definitely evened out over the last 5 years. Which means, not there's no fantasy half, but I've published more. I'm finding more and more really great women writers publishing really great stuff. But it really was true that there were many. It seemed to be, and I believe there were many fewer female writers than there are now, who are really exciting. The ones currently writing, and they're from all different cultures. So I think, eventually I'd like to see no need for a Women in Horror Month. That women are just accepted as, yes, we're they're horror writers and they're horror editors, and not women horror writers or horror editors.
Yeah, Ursula. I'm not really sure. Is it Ursula? Yeah, is it Ursula K. Le Guin, the fantasy author? Now, again,
she wrote science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah.
Not horror.
So, and this is just an admission. As a kid, I used to read a lot of sci-fi, fantasy, and that kind of stuff. But it was mostly like the stuff that was published and that I was aware of. All right, this last year is when I first heard about Ursula K. Le Guin, and I haven't actually read any of her fiction stuff yet. But I've watched a couple of her interviews, and back in the day, she was like one of the, I guess. I don't know how you call it, but one of the female writers that was like kind of changing the atmosphere or changing the platform. And you would have been reading books back then when she was publishing with a not necessarily the first books, but like some of the other stuff. Could you talk about
I didn't
that?
read most of her fantasy, but I did read. Her book, her science fiction book, The Left Hand of Darkness, was incredibly influential and incredibly influential on me as a woman. I thought it was terrific. It's a world where people change their gender depending on who they're with. It's kind of a natural phenomenon, and it just was pretty damn amazing. Sorry, oops, I used the word.
Oh, that's okay. That's not one of the that's not one of George Carlin's 7 forbidden words.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But I didn't read much of her much of her fantasy, but that was the book that really made an impression on me, by Ursula.
And what's interesting for me is that like listening to her, because I like, and I mainly read nonfiction. Listening to her interviews, this lady had an incredible mind and an incredible imagination. And so, can you tell me more about because I know with the last 5 years or so, you said that it's become more of the norm. When you look at the long term, like you said, you hope that it's just going to be where it's the way it is, right? And there's not a need for the Women in Horror Month. Let's just look at 50 years from now. The last 50 years of publishing versus the next 50 years. Do you feel like it's going to be more of interchangeable, or not so much interchangeable? That's not the right word, but more just people are going to be writing. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure.
Hopefully, well, gosh, it's I don't know what's going to happen in the next 50 years. If we're still on the planet.
Hopefully.
But yeah, I think it's changing all the time. You can tell from the award nominations too. That there are many more women included. That it's just you can see the change. It's a sea change, and it's been changing for 10, 20 years. I remember when I was working at OMNI, I noticed that at one point, I think in the short fiction categories, women were coming in and just slamming everything. At a certain point in the 80s, there was Nancy Kress, Pat Cadigan, Ursula was still writing. There were a lot of, Connie Willis. There were a ton of female writers who were coming into their maturity, shall we say, and all getting nominated and winning awards in the short fiction categories, not as much in the novels. I think that took a little longer. but I think that's when it started to change. And then with horror, it's been I'd say the last 5 to 10 years, maybe 10 years. There's been an explosion of female writers. And I'm mostly talking about short fiction, because I'm not on top of novels as I should be. But in short fiction, there's an explosion of female writers, and writers from all over the world.
I think it's a good thing. I think it's really interesting too to see how the landscape's changed so much. And but there was a lot of pushback. I mean, even as a young editor, there were male writers who were pushing back against young female editors in science fiction, calling them the girls of Vassar. I mean, I never went to Vassar. I mean, first of all, that's so classist. Right.
I mean, and on the other hand, book publishing was classist and probably still is. I'm talking about mainstream book publishing. I had a hard time getting anywhere. I did not go to an elite college, and so it's definitely a classist kind of thing. But the women were criticized for doing this, with the implication that they knew nothing about science fiction, because they did not come out of fandom. In the old days, excuse me, most of the editors were either writers, science fiction writers, or they came out of science fiction fandom. And in the 80s, that stopped. I mean, most of them, more editors, there were more professional editors, and the women who became editors were not coming out of fandom. Maybe I'm not sure. They started as editorial assistants at these book publishers and then moved up, but they did not come out of fandom. When I went to OMNI, when I was hired at OMNI, I was given a hard time by some people because, where did I come from? It's like, oh, I wasn't a fan. It's like, why did I get the job and why didn't some fan get the job? And in fact, I had someone toss beer at me at a party, some drunken jerk.
Oh, no.
Threw beer at me years and years and years ago in a New Haven convention because he was jealous. Because, why didn't they ask me to take the job? It's like, because they don't know who the hell you are and they don't care. It's like, so yes, I mean, there was a lot of change from the 80s on.
I've seen, also in horror, there was Richard Lehman wrote a really nasty article in a small press magazine about me and Linda Murata, who worked at Shakespeare and Company and was a horror critic, and I can't remember someone else, another woman, and criticized us for being gatekeepers, and because we didn't like his work, and he just, was really nasty about it. Yeah.
So it's like, these women don't like my work, so they must be bad. It's like, no, we just don't like your work. I'm sure you're a very nice person personally, or you might be, but so what? We didn't review your work, or we reviewed it negatively. That's the way it goes. Grow up. But I mean, people still do things, say things. I mean, men still, behind the back, I'm sure they say things. I remember one time, I can't remember where it was, but it was at least 15 years ago, that someone complained that some anthology was all women. And the fact of the matter was it was more men than women, but it was like enough women that were a large handful. And they consider, it's all men. It's all women being published here. How biased. And it's like, it can't even count. So, yes, I mean, there are people, anytime you have a new group coming in, the old group might be, hopefully they'll embrace the new people, and other times they'll just attack the new people because they're jealous. And they think, they're going to get my piece of the pie. So that's been going on for decades. But things have changed dramatically in the last 10 years.
I'm excited about that change, too. Let me do the station ID real quick. Everybody, you're tuning in today to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul. You're listening to The Adam Messer Show, and I'm your host, Adam Messer, with my special guest, Ellen Datlow. And we're talking about, like, the changing of the guard, pretty much, in the in the publishing industry.
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and the thing too, Ellen, is I am relatively new to publishing and editing. I just started getting into fiction writing in 2014, and I didn't publish my first book until 2018. Didn't do it. I launched that small business, the small publishing business last year. I'm sorry. I published the first book last year, but I started it the year before, and I have interviewed dozens of authors, men and women from all backgrounds and upbringings and pedigrees or whatever you want to call it. And I do feel like it is changing. I have not, well, I'm not going to say I haven't met any of the quote unquote old guard, because I have, but I quickly vet those people out because they're not the kind of folks that I want to be around. And they're not.
Don't blame the whole old guard.
No, not everybody. I'm talking about the ones that are like, hey, it's a boys club, nobody else can get in.
Right.
Those kind of folks. But for the most part, the folks that I've met in writing and publishing are just wonderful people with great imaginations, and they just love, like you love reading, you love stories, and I feel like that's the glue of the community is the storytelling.
Sure. And I think it's important to welcome new writers as much as you can.
Yeah. So you were telling me before you got some new stuff that you've really been enjoying that you're reading. Do you mind sharing any of that with us?
Yeah, I'm in the middle right now. I'm in the middle of reading Chuck Palahniuk's The Invention of Sound, which is a novel that's pretty great so far. I've only read like 30 pages, but I like it so far. I've read some of his earlier work, but nothing lately. And so I find that really interesting. And I just finished reading A Private Cathedral by James Lee Burke, whose work has gotten increasingly supernatural over the years. His Dave Robichaux novel, so I really like that. And I just finished that. And I'm reading, I'm about to, after I finish the Palahniuk, I'm going to read Elizabeth Hand's Book of Lamps and Banners, excuse me, which is one of her, in her Cass Neary series. Cass Neary is a broken down punk photographer who's very self-destructive and destructive in other ways. They're crime novels, really dark, and there's always an edge of the supernatural in them. I love them. And Cass Neary is a fabulous character. And, I'm always hoping someone will make a movie about her.
Oh, that'd be cool.
Yeah, so those are the novels I'm reading right now. I also have a couple that I'm hoping to get to before my deadline. But right now I'm deeply into my reading for the year's best, and also finishing off my Shirley Jackson anthology.
That's really cool.
Which is due in a few weeks.
That's really cool. That is one thing I think we didn't really talk about. I think on the other episode about the year's best. Can you talk about that a little bit more, like the genesis of it, and then like how you've seen it evolve over the years?
Okay, well, initially it was proposed by Jim Frankel, who was someone who, when I started out, I actually did reading for various book publishers, and I read for him at Dell Books, and then we became friendly. And he knew me and Terry Windling. Terry Windling is a fantasy writer, artist, editor, and he thought it was a good idea for us to do. No one had thought of the idea of doing a year's best fantasy and horror together. And he had that idea to do. It was the first 2 years. It was called the year's best fantasy because St. Martin's refused to put horror on the cover, but it was always half and half. And Terry chose the fantasy, and I chose the horror. Once in a while, we overlapped. So we did that for 16, I think, volumes. And then Terry dropped out, and Gavin Grant and Kelly Links took over the fantasy half.
Okay.
And we did that till number 21. And then I think St. Martin's, we had a new editor, the in-house editor. We had different in-house editors over time, and the last one was not very interested in us or the book series.
Oh, no.
So basically, they threw us over. They kind of dumped us. Kind of. I mean, we would have. Basically, they dumped us.
Oh man.
And we were. Jim was trying to sell the series to another publisher, and Gavin and Kelly decided they didn't want to do it anymore, and so that ended. But then I approached another publisher, Nightshade, which at that point was still run by, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting Jason and Jeremy, and I'm blanking on their last names. But I think I did it for them like once or twice, and then their company imploded. And Nightshade was bought by Skyhorse, which is another publisher. And my in-house editor is Jason too, but a different Jason. So I've been doing it for them. I'm working on the 13th year.
Oh wow!
Of working with Nightshade to put out the best horror of the year. So that's kind of how it evolved. So it's only horror and not fantasy anymore, and it hasn't been for a long time.
Yeah. That's a really interesting way to see it kind of grow from, its early days with fantasy, and then not even wanting to put any horror on the cover, to
right.
like the most recent cover, the one with like looks like a horse skeleton head or whatever, kind of like a death.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Yeah, for the years I was finishing hard, Tom Canty did the covers, and they were beautiful. I mean, the first 20 he did were really gorgeous, and then they decided to change the style, and it got increasingly weird, but not very good. Yeah, but I mean, the thing is, I only always did the horror, and the other editors always did the fantasy, and we never read each other's work. Once in a while we overlapped. I mean, Jim was a packager. Jim Frankel was a packager, and he actually put the book together to decide what goes where, what order. So he's the only one who read all the stories. We only read our halves, basically, unless we overlapped. And then we all wrote we signed the introductions. If it was, we each, so people would know if the story was horror or fantasy. We would sign. We'd have our initials, but sometimes we'd have all our initials. So yeah, I mean, I always felt it was really an interesting continuum between fantasy, dark fantasy, to horror. Mm-hmm. So I had no problem with that, and I enjoyed it. having a book like that.
That's one of the things I like about horror, that it covers. I mean, it's like romance; it covers every genre, just about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you can as a writer right now, I'm working on a story where it's sci-fi / horror, and that's one of the things I love about it.
SF horror is a definite subgenre of horror and science fiction, sure.
It's kind of crazy too, because I was having a conversation one time with my friend about Frankenstein, and like Dracula, and like some of these classic monster stories or whatever. Mm-hmm. And when they came out, those books weren't necessarily considered, horror. They're like fantastical, but there was so much technology in them. Well,
not in Dracula, I don't remember, but definitely Frankenstein.
Well, in Dracula, like one of the things that really stuck out for me was like using the Kodak camera.
See, I don't remember that, but
yeah.
All right.
Yeah, but it was like when they were written, it was like written supposed to be like in the present time or whatever. And when we think about like these classic horror stories, we think like Victorian times or whatever.
Sure, but to them it was classic,
right? Yeah. To them it was like contemporary, Mm-hmm. And I always thought that was interesting.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of lost. I mean, they were called Gothic. They weren't called horror.
Right, Gothic. Yeah.
A lot of the material published, and there were a lot of female Gothic writers who are totally forgotten today. There was a whole rash of women writers who were writing the Gothic and ghost stories in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and even the late 1900s. I mean, there have been collections of them, to bring them back to people's notice, but usually they're small press, so not everyone, afford them. They can be expensive, so it's hard to get a hold of them sometimes to see what the history of women in horror / Gothic.
I think it's interesting, and I can't believe it's already time for us to wrap up this hour, Ellen. Oh, man. Thank you so much for being on the show.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So ellendatlow.com, is that the best website for people to go to?
Datlow.com, I think it is, but yeah, sure. It's not quite up to date, but it's there.
It'll get you there. And then you have your Amazon page too with it's got links to all your...
Yeah, and you can follow me on Facebook or Twitter.
Okay, cool. Well, Ellen, thank you so much.
That's where anything up to date is. Yeah, my website is it's ellendatlow.com. It's not particularly up to date. I can do the Best Horror of the Year number, Volume 9. Nothing beyond that. I don't think it hasn't been updated for ages.
That's okay. It'll get them where they need to go.
Kind of a placeholder, nothing else.
Well, thank you very much, Ellen. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the next time we hang out and talk.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
All right, everybody, stay tuned because in the next hour we're going to be playing the original interview that I did with Ellen, and then tonight the podcast will be up that you can hear it. If you missed any part of this, you can go back and listen to the whole thing. All right, you're listening to WRUU LP Savannah, Georgia, 107.5 FM, WRUU.org. We are Savannah Soundings Community Radio with Global Soul.
The Live Oak Public Library System offers local residents access to hundreds of thousands of movies, television programs, albums, audiobooks, ebooks,